You're standing in a limestone cave in the west of England. It's cold. Water is moving somewhere below you in the dark, a river running under the hill. Outside, the valley is a gorge cut deep into the rock, and beyond that, tundra, horses, reindeer, a world with no farms in it, and no towns, and no writing, and no name for the year. 14,700 years ago, people lived in this cave. They made tools out of flint. They carved reindeer antler. They kept dogs, or something close to dogs. They were us. Same brain, same hands, same capacity for boredom and love and cruelty as anyone you'll pass on the street tomorrow. And on the floor of that cave, mixed in with the bones of horse and red deer and Arctic fox, archaeologists found something else. A human skull, or most of one. The face was gone. The base was gone. What was left was the brain case, the dome, and around the broken edge, somebody had gone back again and again with a stone tool, chipping small flakes away until the rim was even. They had made a bowl. Not by accident, not by dropping it. Somebody sat in this cave with a person's head in their hands and gave it an edge you could drink from. In 2011, a team from the Natural History Museum in London, led by Sylvia Bello, went back through the Goss Cave remains under a microscope. They weren't looking for a story. They were looking at cut marks. And the cut marks told them the order of operations. First, the head was cleaned. Not scraped in a hurry, cleaned. There are marks from cutting away the lips, marks on the cheeks, marks from removing the tongue, marks around the eye sockets where the eyes were taken out. Then the face was removed, the jaw, the cheekbones, the whole front of the person taken off. Then the base of the skull was cut away, leaving the dome. And then the shaping, the careful chipping around the broken edge, working around and around until the rough break became a rim. Bello's team dated the bones directly, using an ultrafiltration method that strips out contamination. About 14,700 years old, which makes these the oldest directly dated skull cups on Earth. Not the oldest in Britain, the oldest anywhere. Now, sit with that for a second, because there's a question hiding inside it that most people never ask. Why go to the trouble? If you want what's inside a human head, if you want the brain, which is fatty and rich and one of the most calorie-dense things on a body, you don't do any of this. You put the skull on a rock and you hit it. 10 seconds, done. Cleaning the lips off first is not something a hungry person does. The obvious explanation, and the one almost everyone reaches for, is starvation. Ice age, hard winter, nothing to eat. Desperate people doing a desperate thing. It's a comfortable answer because it lets us off the hook. Starvation isn't a decision, it's a situation. You can look at a starving person eating another person and feel pity instead of anything more complicated. Except the cave doesn't support it. Look at what else was on that floor. Wild horse, in quantity. Red deer, wolf, brown bear, lynx, saiga antelope, Arctic fox, Arctic hare, butchered, processed, eaten, discarded in the same layers as the human remains. These people were not out of food. They were hunters in a landscape full of animals, and they were doing well enough at it that the horse bones outnumber almost everything else in the cave. So the starvation explanation runs into a wall. And when you knock it down, you're left holding something much stranger. Because they did eat them. That part is not in doubt, and we'll come back to it, and it's worse than you're expecting. But the skulls were not treated like food. Food doesn't get its lips removed. Food doesn't get a rim. Whatever those people were doing in that cave, they weren't solving a problem. They were performing an act. And an act has meaning, which means somewhere in the Ice Age, in the dark, By a fire, a human head stopped being a head and became an object that stood for something. That's the real discovery at Gough's Cave, not cannibalism. Cannibalism is common in nature. Ants do it. Fish do it. Chimpanzees do it. Chimpanzees don't make cups. And here's what makes this genuinely difficult. The thing that stops this being a simple story about ancient savagery. If they'd just been butchering enemies, we could file it away. If they'd just been grieving, we could file that away too. They appear to have been doing both, at the same time, to the same people. To understand how that's even possible, we have to leave this cave. And we have to go somewhere the anthropologists actually got to watch it happen. 4 years after the skull cup paper, Bellows' team came back to Gough's Cave and looked at the rest of the bodies. Not the skulls, everything else. Arms, legs, ribs, hands, feet. What they found closed off any remaining escape route. Defleshing marks where the muscle was cut away from the bone. Disarticulation marks at the joints where the body was taken apart. Long bones snapped open in a way that only makes sense if you want the marrow inside. Spongy bone crushed, and on many of the bones, chewing. Human chewing. Human tooth marks. You can argue about cut marks. Stone tools and animal teeth can look similar to an untrained eye, and archaeologists have spent decades fighting about it. You cannot really argue about a human bite mark on a human bone. So, they ate them. Fully. Systematically. Marrow, muscle, brain, the works. This wasn't a ritual nibble. It was a complete processing of a body, using the same techniques these people used on a horse, in the same cave, probably on the same day. And then, in the middle of all that, they stopped, picked up the head, and spent what must have been an hour or more making it beautiful. That's the contradiction. Butchery and craftsmanship running side by side, which means the question we started with was the wrong question. We asked why they drank from skulls. The better question is this: what kind of mind eats a person and honors them in the same afternoon? Because to us, those two things cancel out. Eating someone is the ultimate degradation. It's what we do to animals we consider beneath us. It's the thing every horror story reaches for when it wants to strip a human being of dignity. But that reaction, the disgust, the assumption that consumption equals contempt, is not a fact about the world. It's a fact about us. In the 1980s, an American anthropologist named Beth Conklin went to live with the Wari, a people in western Brazil, in the state of Rondônia. She stayed 18 months. She went back 3 more times. Until the 1960s, the Wari ate their dead. They practiced 2 kinds of cannibalism, and Conklin's central finding, the thing that makes her work matter here, is that the two had almost nothing in common except the mechanics. When they killed an enemy, they ate him with contempt. He was not a person. He was meat, treated like game, and eating him was an act of aggression, an insult carried on past death. When one of their own died, they ate them too, and that was an act of love. The bodies of their own dead were consumed at funerals, by relatives, and it was not enjoyable. Conklin describes it as difficult, as something people did because they were obliged to, and because refusing would have wounded the family. The corpse was decaying. It was not a feast. It was closer to a duty. And the reason they did it, according to the Wari themselves, was grief. They believed the body had to be destroyed. Leaving it in the ground, whole, to rot slowly in a place the family would have to walk past, was unbearable. So they consumed it, and they burned the person's house, and they burned their belongings, and they took apart the physical world that person had occupied, so that the survivors could begin to let go. One Wari elder put it to Conklin in a way that has stayed in the literature ever since. He said, roughly, "I felt sorry for the one who had died. That is why I ate him." This is not an isolated logic. The Yanomami ground the cremated bones and ash of their relatives and consumed them. The Amawaka picked bone from the cremation fire, ground it with corn, and drank it. Drank it. That is a person, in a cup, and it happened in the 20th century. So Conklin gives us a model. The same act, cannibalism, can mean two opposite things depending on who is being eaten and why. Love or hatred, kin or enemy. It's not the act that carries the meaning, it's the intention. Which leaves us with an obvious problem. Intentions don't fossilize. You cannot dig up a motive. For decades, this was the wall the Goss Cave story ran into. We knew what happened. We could not know what it meant. The skull cups looked reverent, but looked reverent is not evidence. And archaeology is full of people who saw what they wanted to see in a pile of old bones. And then, in February 2025, a team publishing in scientific reports gave us the other half of the picture. Not from England, from a cave in southern Poland near Krakow called Machitska. Same people, more or less, the Magdalenians. Same broad culture, same Ice Age Europe, roughly 18,000 years ago, a few thousand years before Goff's Cave. The bones had been sitting in a museum in Krakow since the 19th century. Francesc Marginetis and his colleagues put them under 3D microscopy, and they found cannibalism. Cut marks made by stone tools shortly after death. Long bones broken open for marrow. Bodies processed whole. Adults and children treated exactly the same way. No selection, no ceremony. And the skulls. The skulls at Machitska were broken open too. But the breakage pattern is wrong for a skull cup. It's the pattern you get when someone wants what's inside and nothing else. No shaping, no rim, no care. The human remains were found mixed into the settlement rubbish, thrown in with the debris of daily life. The researchers were blunt about what that implies. These dead were not treated with respect. They think it points to violence between groups, conflict cannibalism. So now hold the two caves side by side. Poland, humans eaten, humans discarded, skulls smashed like nuts. England, humans eaten, and their heads turned into vessels by someone willing to spend an hour removing the eyelids. Same era, same culture, same species. Which means Goff's Cave was not a technique. It was not what Ice Age people simply did. It was a choice. And once you know somebody chose it, you have to ask the only question that's left. What were they choosing it for? If Goff's Cave were the only place this happened, we could call it local. One group, one winter, one strange custom in one cave in Somerset, and no wider meaning at all. It isn't the only place. There are skull cups at Les Lacaves in the Charente region of France. There are skull cups at Istrovitz in the Basque country near the Pyrenees. Same period, same Magdalenian world, hundreds of miles apart, and the same idea arriving at the same solution. That distribution matters. A one-off is an accident. A pattern is a culture. Somewhere in Ice Age Europe, there was a shared understanding, passed between groups who may never have met, that a human head could become a container. And then the Magdalenians disappear, the ice retreats, farming arrives, cities happen, writing happens, and roughly 14,000 years go by. And the skull cup shows up again in the historical record like nothing ever happened. Around 440 BC, Herodotus is writing about the Scythians, the horse nomads of the steppe north of the Black Sea. He describes what a Scythian warrior does with an enemy's head, and the description is uncomfortably procedural. He cuts a line around the skull above the ears. He takes the scalp. He scrapes it clean with the rib of an ox and softens it by rubbing it between his hands, and then he uses it as a napkin and hangs it from his bridle. The more napkins a man can show, the more he's respected. Then the skull itself, cleaned, turned into a drinking cup. And if the man is rich, Herodotus says, he lines the inside with gold. Now, this is the version everyone knows, the skull cup as trophy, the enemy reduced to tableware. It's the version in every film and every fantasy novel, and it seems to settle the question. They drank from skulls to humiliate the dead and glorify themselves. Except Herodotus adds one more sentence, and almost nobody quotes it. He says they do the same thing with the skulls of their own relatives, their own kin, family members they'd fallen out with, defeated in a feud, settled in front of the king, and then made into a cup. Which breaks the trophy explanation open. If it were purely about the enemy, purely about the outsider, you would never do it to your brother. But the Scythians did, according to the man who tells us most about them. So even here, in the clearest, most famous, most quotable account of drinking from a skull, the meaning is slipping. It's not enemy or family, it's both. Unless, of course, Herodotus was wrong. Fast forward 1200 years. In the summer of 811, a Byzantine emperor named Nicephorus I marched an army north into Bulgaria, burned the Bulgar capital, and on the way home walked into an ambush in a mountain pass. He was killed at the Battle of Pliska. Emperors were not supposed to die on the battlefield. It had barely happened in centuries, and according to the Byzantine chronicler Theophanes the Confessor, and after him Zonaras, and the Manassas Chronicle, and others, Khan Krum of the Bulgars took the emperor's head, had the skull cleaned and lined with silver, and drank from it. It's one of the most repeated images in medieval history. It's on the murals. It's in the textbooks. Krum, at a feast, raising an emperor's skull. Here's the problem. The historian John Wortley has pointed out something awkward about this story. Theophanes was an educated Byzantine. Educated Byzantines read Herodotus. And what does everyone know about the barbarians beyond the Danube, on the steppe, out there in the dark? They drink from skulls. Herodotus said so. Krum lived beyond the Danube. Krum was, in the Byzantine imagination, a Scythian in everything but name. So when a chronicler sitting in Constantinople reaches for a way to describe what kind of man defeats and kills a Roman emperor, he may not be reporting. He may be reaching for a 1,000-year-old stock image and dropping it onto a new enemy. It might be true. It might be half true. It might be a slur so old that by 811 it was practically a genre convention. And that possibility opens a door into something genuinely strange about human beings. Because notice what the accusation does. It doesn't say the barbarian is violent. Everyone is violent. Byzantium was extremely violent. It says the barbarian does something to a body that we would never do. That's the line, not killing. The line is what you do to the dead afterwards. Every civilization seems to need that line, and every civilization seems to draw it just outside its own borders, and the skull cup keeps getting used to draw it. It's such a powerful image of the inhuman that it works whether or not it ever happened. Which raises a question that should make you slightly nervous. If the story is that useful, if it's that good at proving somebody else is a monster, what were the people telling it doing at home? It's the 2nd of February, 1685, Whitehall Palace, London. King Charles II wakes up feeling wrong. He is 54. In 4 days, he will be dead, and the first thing he reaches for, before the physicians arrive, before the bleeding and the blistering and the panic, is a medicine he made himself. Charles was a keen amateur chemist. He had his own laboratory, and he had paid an enormous sum, said to be £6,000, to a physician named Jonathan Goddard for one particular recipe. It became so closely associated with him that people simply called it the King's Drops. The recipe is not complicated. Take a human skull, grind it into a fine powder, distill it with alcohol, drink it. It was sometimes called spirit of skull. Charles took it regularly. He mixed it into wine. He reportedly mixed it into chocolate. He recommended it to his courtiers, who drank it at court, in the most sophisticated room in England, out of the finest glassware money could buy. As he lay dying, his doctors poured high doses of it into him. Now, I want to be precise about how normal this was, because the instinct is to file it as one eccentric king with a morbid hobby. The historian Richard Sugg has documented this in detail, and his summary is stark. For well over 200 years in early modern Europe, the rich and the poor, the educated and the illiterate, all participated in cannibalism on a more or less routine basis. Not metaphorically, medicinally. Human fat was melted and rubbed into wounds and joints. Human blood was drunk fresh because it was thought to carry the vitality of life. Egyptian mummies were ground up and sold in apothecaries, and skull was everywhere. Skull for headaches, skull for epilepsy, skull for convulsions. Even the moss that grew on unburied skulls had a market. It was called usnia, and it was scraped off battlefield dead. And the preference tells you what people thought they were buying, because the best usnia came from young men who had died violently, on the grounds that a violent death traps the life force inside the body before it can escape. The skull, in other words, was believed to be a container, not for liquid, for a person's remaining power. Sugg found the practice dying out slowly, and much later than anyone expects. In 1847, an Englishman was advised to treat his daughter's epilepsy by mixing the skull of a young woman with treacle and feeding it to her. He did it. That is 14 years into Queen Victoria's reign. There were photographs by then. There were railways. So here is the collapse. While Byzantine chroniclers were writing horrified accounts of barbarians drinking from human skulls, and while Victorian gentlemen were unpacking the Goths' cave bones and shaking their heads at the savagery of prehistoric man, Europeans were drinking human skulls. In wine, in chocolate, from cups made of porcelain and silver. The Magdalenians used the skull as the cup. The English put the skull in the cup. The distance between those two things is a matter of table manners. Which brings us back to Somerset, and to the thing I haven't told you yet. The human remains at Goth's Cave belong to somewhere between 5 and 7 people. Adults, 2 adolescents, and a child of about 3 years old. A toddler. Someone who had been walking for maybe a year and a half. Who had, in all likelihood, been carried into that cave in somebody's arms, alive, not long before. Their skull was worked too, and once you know that, the trophy explanation dies where it stands. Nobody takes a 3-year-old as a war prize. Nobody defeats a toddler in battle. Whatever happened in that cave was almost certainly done by people who knew that child, who had fed that child, who had heard that child cry in the dark. Somebody sat with the head of a 3-year-old they knew and worked around the rim, over and over, until the edge was smooth. And I don't think that is savagery. I think that is grief, with a stone tool in its hand. We have never found a way to leave the dead alone. That is the one thing the whole record agrees on. From a cave in the Ice Age, to a Brazilian funeral in 1960, to a king's bedroom in Whitehall. Every culture that has ever existed has done something to its dead beyond what the situation requires. We burn them and keep the ash. We put the ash in a jar and put the jar on a shelf. We wear a piece of someone's hair in a locket. We visit a stone with a name on it, and we talk out loud to it, knowing perfectly well that nobody is there. We take what is left of a person and we put it into a container, and we tell ourselves it helps. And it does help. That's the strange part. It works. The people at Gough's Cave weren't doing something we grew out of. They were doing the first version of something we never stopped doing. They just did it with the only material they had, in a world with no urns and no headstones and no photographs, where a body was the only object a person left behind. They were the first people we know of who looked at a dead human being and refused to accept that it was only meat. That refusal is not a Stone Age problem that got solved. It's on your mantelpiece.